Hey everybody, happy Thursday and welcome back. I hope you've been doing well. For those of you that might be new, my name is Susan. I am a freelance fiction editor specializing in science fiction, fantasy, and romance. This week we're going to talk about scene evaluation. So whether you're currently plotting your novel or you're editing your novel, so you've already written it and you're working your way through, scene evaluation is a really important tool to make sure you're keeping your pacing and your story arc as tight and as clean as possible. But this can be a really hard thing to do, especially if you've written a super complex world with tons of world building and characters and all sorts of plot lines everywhere. So this week I thought it'd be useful to go through my top 5 questions of how to evaluate each scene. These are questions that I use as I work through my edits, making sure each scene is as powerful and as vital as possible and making sure it works with the story. So the first question is, what are you expecting the reader to get out of this scene? I know it sounds sort of like a crazy question. If the reader wasn't supposed to get anything out of it, why would the chapter be in there? But you would be surprised when you go through on a scene-by-scene basis how some of those pieces can get a bit lost and muddled when you're thinking about the plot or the story arc overall instead of all of the individual components. So I highly recommend you go through and you look at each scene and you say, okay, what do I want the reader to see here, to experience, to understand? And then look at that answer and see how it plays with the rest of your story arc within the context of all of the goals and motivations and plot points that you have built in. Then ask yourself, does that make sense here? Is it repetitive? Is there a better place or a better way to show this somewhere else? And make sure that the reader is getting what they need out of that scene and that it is absolutely necessary. Question number 2, how do my characters change? So whether your character is growing or regressing, we can go positive or negative here. You want to see some sort of character change within each chapter that is tied to their goals and motivation, both internal and external. Again, sort of like the above, you would think this would be obvious, but as you're looking at a plot overall, especially if you're an author that focuses very much on story, on plot structure, this can be something that gets missed a lot. So then you have a character that is the exact same at the beginning of a scene as they are at the end of a scene, and it can fall very flat. So you want to make sure there's some sort of change, again, whether positive or negative, that your character is growing through, that your reader is experiencing with them, not only to help them see that change, help them reach their goal, whatever it may be, but also to help that reader character connection, get them even more invested in the story. Question number 3, how does this move my plot forward? So now obviously this works in tandem with the character changes. It's a bit on the opposite side of the coin. So now if you're focused too much on character changes, you may see absolutely no plot moving forward, and that is also not what you want to happen. A great example of this is if you have a chapter that's fully a flashback or a lot of backstory or world building. You might see a lot of character growth and progress as they learn about the villain's tragic backstory, or they learn more about the context of the world, so they're able to put all of the problems that they have in context and really understand it more, maybe have more sympathy or more kindness, or be absolutely infuriated. You can really have that character development, but you want to make sure those pieces are still moving your plot forward as well, that you're learning more or they're able to do something with that also, because otherwise your characters may change, but then your readers are going to feel a bit bereft at the end of the chapter because nothing will have really happened for the story, the plot that they're really reading this for, that they want to see come to fruition, that they want to see happen. So you want to make sure you have both of these pieces working, that they not only work in tandem, but you make sure you have each individual piece in there. Question number 4, is your action, dialogue, and narrative balanced? So now for this, we're actually looking at the structure of the scene, not necessarily what's in it. So not your characters and their goals, not the plot or anything like that, but literally the different components of the chapter. So do you have action? Are they at least moving around or fighting or leaving the house, going somewhere? Do you have dialogue? Are they talking to themselves or each other or talking to someone? As well as narrative, do you have description, atmosphere, backstory, everything like that? A really well-rounded chapter has a little bit of everything in it. Now, granted, each chapter needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. If you're in the middle of a massive war, there are going to be some chapters that are heavier on the fighting. That's perfectly logical and definitely makes sense. But in that specific instance, it's a great example of you want to have a lot of fighting, but you also want to make sure to balance that with a quick conversation here and there. Not enough to take away from the action, but to give the reader more context, or maybe to give them a break from such an intense scene or fight or, death. And you also want to make sure you're putting a narrative there as well. So you're explaining what's happening, you're giving context as to who's fighting who, or you want to describe more, you want to give more of the atmosphere as well. Having all of this balanced in your scene is really important to make sure you're giving the reader the full picture, as well as keeping the pacing moving so that they're seeing all these pieces, putting them together, and they're not stuck on just one side of things. Depending on whether it's dialogue or action or what have you, it can be either very overwhelming or it can be very boring. So you want to make sure you have that balance. A great test of this, I've talked about it in other videos before, is the white space test. So if you're looking at your manuscript, you can also look at other books that you have on your shelf, look at their white space. So if it is a chapter that has a good balance between the white space on the page and the words, then it's probably a pretty well balanced chapter, even without looking at whether it's narrative, action, or dialogue. Again, because all of those things are structured a bit differently on the page. But looking at it, obviously, for piece by piece, you can make sure that's balanced as well. So if it's super white, if your page is just very empty feeling, you probably lean towards either too much dialogue or too much action, because dialogue and action can be very short, they can be very staccato, and they can leave a lot of white space on the page. Counter to that, if your page is just a solid block of words, you've probably delved a bit too far into the narrative or description or world building, and you might be overwhelming the reader. So see if you can parcel that out a bit more, throw in some action or dialogue, be able to switch that up so that you have that balance, so that you're not only keeping the reader's attention, but you're also maintaining that pacing. Question number 5, does your chapter link well with the one before and the one after? You want to make sure it is playing its part within the section, the part that it's in. So you want to lead in with an intriguing beginning. Now, as a caveat, I'm not saying you need to make each opening sentence absolutely unique and captivating and everything like that. There are some sentences in some chapters that you want it to be mundane, that you're showing that for a specific reason. So when I say you want an intriguing beginning, I'm talking about you want to make sure it's intriguing to the readers in that instance, where they're at in the story and what they need or want at that point, whether it's high action or maybe a chill break sleeping in bed. Whichever works best for where you're at. Same thing with the ending. You want a great hook that leads into the next chapter, keeping them reading. Again, whether that means you're closing a really epic scene, or maybe you're ending on a cliffhanger, a huge death, whatever works for where you're at, that's going to keep them reading. Finally, a bonus question. For those of you that follow story beats or a specific arc model or method, does your chapter make sense in the context of whatever story beat or percentage that you're supposed to be at that point in time? So is it playing its purpose not only with the scenes around it and in the plot as a whole, but in the structure that you are trying to follow? So you want to make sure you're evaluating that as well. And does it work where you're currently at? I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions, I would love to hear from you. Don't hesitate to reach out. Like, comment, and subscribe below. It really helps the channel. And until next week, keep writing.